Late evening covered Chicago with a gray blanket of silence in the soft glow of streetlights. In the tiny living room of an apartment located on the top floor of an old building, Evelyn felt as if time had slowed to a crawl. The whole house was quiet, only occasionally broken by the distant sound of sirens or the rustle of wind seeping through gaps in the window frames. No one would have thought a regular Friday could bring so many anxious thoughts and expectations. Evelyn, a woman in her 40s, sat on a worn-out couch, pulling her legs under herself and clutching an old pillow. She exhaled noisily, feeling the first lonely raindrops begin to tap against the glass, as if echoing her inner turmoil. She had always liked listening to the rain, but today it sounded especially sharp, mingling with the pulse of her own heart. She gazed into the dimness of the room, where faint reflections of streetlights played on the walls in whimsical shadows. A soft knock on the door broke the silence. She flinched, her heart skipping a beat. At such a late hour, no one usually bothered her, except perhaps Michael, a roommate and close friend. Feeling both relieved and slightly uneasy at the same time, she rose from the couch, fixing her disheveled hair, and headed for the door. "Michael?" she called quietly, barely opening the door. Behind the frame, she saw a familiar silhouette. Michael stood in the hallway, shifting his weight hesitantly from one foot to the other. His sturdy raincoat was speckled with raindrops, and in his eyes there seemed to be exhaustion and uncertainty. "Sorry to bother you," he said softly, lowering his gaze. "Can you let me in for a couple of minutes? Something's bothering me." Evelyn realized something serious must be going on with him, because Michael normally didn't like having personal talks at this hour. Without asking unnecessary questions, she stepped aside to let him in. The man entered, pulled off his coat, and hung it on the back of a wooden chair by the wall. Under the faint glow of a small lamp, his face appeared pale and his features sharp. "Sit down," Evelyn offered, pointing to the couch. "At least the rain didn't drench you too badly?" He sighed, giving a weak smile, and sat next to her, maintaining a small distance. A small table lamp cast a gentle orange light over the room, lending it a sense of closeness and comfort. Yet at the same time, the atmosphere felt tense. "I probably look strange," Michael said, lacing his fingers together. "But this entire week has been unbearable for me. I feel like I'm going crazy from the thoughts that torment me." She noticed his fingers trembling slightly, which worried her even more than the setting. Michael had always been strong and reliable, the one who calmed her when she herself was on the verge of a breakdown. Today, however, he appeared weaker and more vulnerable than ever. "What happened, Michael?" she asked, trying to keep her voice gentle. "I'm not just living here for no reason. We share this place and hope it becomes something like a haven for both of us. If something's bothering you, tell me." He did not respond immediately, as though looking for the right words, which did not come easily to him. Outside, the rain pounded relentlessly, and in the apartment it became so still that Evelyn could hear her own heart beating. For a long time, I thought of you as a friend," he began in a subdued voice. "Well, not just a friend. See, it's always been easy for us, and I never thought it might become a problem. But now I'm experiencing a strange feeling, and it won't leave me in peace." Evelyn frowned, afraid to guess what he might say, yet simultaneously feeling a growing lump in her chest, a premonition that Michael's confession would change their familiar world forever. "Speak," she said quietly. "I won't judge you." Michael filled his lungs with air, then exhaled, closing his eyes. The lines on his forehead showed his inner struggle. "I thought it would pass," he admitted. "I believed I could handle it, but it only grows stronger. You see, I don't look at you just as a friend or a roommate. I'm afraid I'll destroy our friendship if I say this out loud, but I can't lie to myself anymore." Evelyn felt her inner world wobble. Michael's words, virtually a declaration of affection she had been trying not to acknowledge, shattered the familiar boundaries. What connected them wasn't years of kinship, but a long, time-tested friendship. The prohibition and fear here didn't stem from any family ties, but from a promise they had once made to each other. Not to complicate life with romantic relationships, and now everything seemed to be changing. She placed her hand over his, trying to convey at least a fraction of the calm she herself lacked. Michael trembled at her touch but did not pull away. Michael, this is very serious, she whispered. I also feel something's off between us. But I'm afraid, what if we ruin everything? We made an agreement long ago not to cross those lines, so we could keep our friendship. He looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. His gaze held pain, a plea, and hope. Yes, I remember how we pledged that to each other, he replied. But maybe we promised it when we were different people? Or maybe we just never expected life to turn out this way? The room became unbearably stuffy, though rain was cooling the city outside. Evelyn sensed a hot wave surge through her body. Fear that a single wrong move could bring their entire bond crashing down. Yet doing nothing was also impossible. By acknowledging this feeling, they had stepped onto new ground full of prohibitions and anxieties. A silence followed, thick with the subtle echoes of what each of them dreaded to say aloud. Michael took a deep breath and made a desperate attempt to regain composure. I'm sorry, he whispered. Maybe I shouldn't have come to you so late at night. Evelyn let her gaze travel over his tired face and the raindrops in his hair. Then summoning her courage, she gently said, No, it's right that you came. It's just, everything is so unexpected. I need to figure out what we're going to do next. He nodded, ran a hand over his face as if trying to wipe away the burden of indecision. I don't know either, he answered with bitterness. Maybe we need time to think, but I don't want to lose you. Evelyn's heart seemed to clench with sympathy, regret, and an anxious tenderness she could no longer deny. The night felt endless, and in its silence, they both sensed that their friendship and their lives would never be the same again. Let's just try to sleep tonight, she finally said in a hush, embarrassed by her own words. We'll talk about it tomorrow, okay? Michael, averting his eyes, reluctantly nodded. He got up, picked up his coat, though he was in no hurry to leave. Evelyn walked him to the door, still not fully believing what had happened. When the door closed behind him, she sank onto the couch, leaning her back against the soft upholstery. Her mind raced with too many thoughts. The whisper of rain against the windows and the distant noise of the street blended into a backdrop for her inner drama. What happens now, she asked herself, recalling Michael's look, filled not only with confusion, but also with a feeling that could transform their former tranquility into a series of anxieties and hopes. Thus ended a night of unease, which for both of them marked the beginning of a journey, where between solid friendship and the possibility of love, a complicated and, it seemed, forbidden barrier was rising. And in that silent conflict between right and what the heart urges, a story began to form about the fate of their future relationship. Morning found Evelyn in an unusual state, worry and anxiety interlaced with the pre-dawn gloom of her bedroom, where every corner reminded her of what had occurred during the night. The cold wind outside the window and the steady hum of cars on a distant highway, all the familiar sounds of the big city at this early hour, seemed somehow muted, while her inner dialogue took center stage. She rose from the bed, feeling the weight in her movements after a night haunted by thoughts. The previous evening, her encounter with Michael, and his confession churned in her head in an endless loop. His words, spoken in a dimly lit living room, sounded in her memory, now full of pain, now full of hope. Entering the kitchen, Evelyn automatically switched on the coffee maker. The aroma of fresh coffee usually soothed her, but today it brought no sense of relief. She stared at the white ceramic mug as if the answers to all her questions were inscribed there. What do I do? How do I handle these newly emerged feelings? These thoughts refused to leave, causing her heart to beat faster. Several minutes passed in almost palpable silence. Then careful footsteps sounded in the hallway. Michael emerged from his room, tired and tense, wearing a t-shirt and casual sweatpants, hair slightly tousled. His appearance betrayed a sleepless night. Shadows under his eyes and an unusual stiffness in his movements showed that he too had barely slept. Hi, Evelyn said uncertainly, trying to make her voice sound friendly. Good morning, Michael replied, stopping in the doorway to the kitchen. Evidently, he too was unsure how to behave. Their usual easygoing manner of communication seemed to have vanished. An awkward pause filled the air. On the table in front of them sat only one cup of coffee, but neither made a move to pour a second. They avoided meeting each other's gaze, as if the walls themselves were silently watching with disapproval. Look, Evelyn finally spoke, feeling a painful lump in her throat. About what happened yesterday, I don't want to pretend it didn't happen. We need to talk. Michael nodded, slouching his shoulders as he lowered himself onto a chair. He stared intently at the pattern on the kitchen floor, as if searching for salvation there. Evelyn sat across from him, her fingers gripping the cold ceramic mug. I know, Michael said softly, not looking up. Yesterday I just blurted everything out so suddenly. Maybe I shouldn't have, but I couldn't hold it back anymore. Evelyn took a deep breath to gather her thoughts. You're not to blame for being honest about how you feel, she replied, striving to keep her voice steady. It's just that now we have to figure out what to do about this feeling. He sighed and finally looked at her. In his eyes, she saw anxiety, but also a quiet resolve. I'm scared that if we try to keep things as they were, we'll just drift apart. I don't want that. But radically changing everything, I'm not sure if that's possible. Evelyn clenched her hands together, feeling the tremor of tension creeping up her spine. Deep down, she knew that his anxiety would echo in her with the same tone. Both of them were doubly afraid of destroying what had become the foundation of their peace and stability. But denying the new feelings had become impossible. Long ago, when they first met, they promised each other not to complicate their friendship and cohabitation with romantic entanglements. It seemed like a convenient safeguard against unforeseen problems. But life was changing. They themselves had changed. Evelyn recalled times they laughed together over movies, shared bags of takeout, chatted about trivial things. Now every word felt weighted, and every gesture a potential confession. Remember how we used to joke that we'd never cross that line? She asked quietly, gazing at his tense face. Of course I do, he answered with a bitter smile. You know, sometimes I felt like we'd already crossed every line, but we just didn't want to admit it. Michael's words felt painfully true. Each of them deep down suspected that their feelings had long since become more than mere friendship, but they both refused to acknowledge it, hoping it would just pass. So what do we do now? Evelyn asked, lightly biting her lip to stop her voice from shaking. If we move forward, we could destroy everything. If we act like there's nothing, we'll lose each other anyway. I'm not sure, Michael repeated, averting his eyes. Maybe we have to try keeping our distance until we figure out how we feel. You see for yourself how this tension between us is growing. His voice sounded resigned. Evelyn wanted to respond, but the words wouldn't come. The thought of distance frightened her. She didn't want to lose his presence, but continuing to lie to themselves felt even more agonizing. She noticed his hands unconsciously moving toward hers, but he quickly stopped, as though afraid of the consequences. That simple gesture pierced her heart because in those moments she realized how much he meant to him and how important he was to her. Eventually, they decided not to make any rash decisions. They spoke for a few more minutes about day-to-day matters to lessen the strain. Quietly, Michael asked if she wanted some breakfast, an ordinary weekend morning ritual. Evelyn nodded, giving a faint smile. In the everyday rhythm of toasting bread and opening the fridge, they tried to find some sort of anchor. But in each of them, questions began to form. Can we keep living under the same roof? Will this admission destroy everything we've built for so long? Only the sounds of dishes and the ticking clock measuring the seconds of their indecision broke the silence. When breakfast was nearly ready, Michael lifted his head to speak but hesitated. At least let's not shut each other out entirely, he suggested, peering into her face. I'm scared, but I don't want to lose what we have. Evelyn met his gaze with full agreement. Agreed. We'll find a way, probably. We just need time, right? Thus, the morning, which began with an unpleasant heaviness, ended in a faint whisper of hope. They realized that they stood at a crossroads that might determine the rest of their lives. The open confession brought with it a whirlwind of questions, and the old prohibition, once a sensible shield for their friendship, was now crumbling under the pressure of feelings, making them suffer from uncertainty. There were still many conversations and new fears ahead, but even the chance to speak openly, without hiding behind pretense, felt like a small beam of light in the labyrinth of their relationship. They didn't know what decision all this would lead to, but they clearly understood. The old boundaries no longer worked, and the future offered either freedom or loss, and both frightened them equally. So ended their morning dialogue. a silent agreement to give the situation time and space, consciously accepting that they had stepped onto a path where there were no simple answers anymore. By the next day early evening, Evelyn stood at the slightly open window in the living room, looking out at the street view. Twilight settled softly over the city, with golden pink hues of the setting sun reflecting in the windows of neighboring houses. It seemed like any ordinary moment, a quiet Saturday night, a light breeze coming from the river, but inside her, a genuine emotional storm raged. Memories of her conversation with Michael weighed heavily on her heart, his quiet confession, her own contradictory feelings, the thought that they had effectively crossed the line they themselves had once drawn. Evelyn felt a growing anxiety in her chest. She realized that next, they would have to choose between preserving the past, their long friendship, and seeking a new path where passion and tenderness might bring profound changes. She tried to figure out why it all felt so agonizing. Hadn't she had relationships before? But this was different. Not ordinary infatuation, but a perilous mix of deep attachment and newly sparked romance. "Somewhere inside I feel it too," she whispered to herself, looking at her reflection in the glass. "But where will it lead if we decide to cross the boundaries we're used to?" The apartment felt too cramped, the air thick with tension. At any moment, Evelyn expected Michael to come out of his room, and their eyes would meet like two magnets, both attracting and repelling each other. Their once effortless conversations now became infrequent and cautious, as if each feared saying too much. Glancing around the living room, she noticed their shared household notes still lying on the table. A grocery list, a cleaning schedule, the weekly plan. Their past cohabitation had seemed carefree and clear through these small details. Now every item seemed to remind her of how much they had changed in the last 24 hours. When she moved away from the window and headed down the hallway to the kitchen, Michael's door opened a crack and he peered out. Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. She immediately sensed the shy smile on his face and the same turmoil in his eyes that she herself felt. "Hey," he said hesitantly, still standing in the doorway. "I was thinking maybe we could order some food, get our minds off things." His words were quiet, as though he wasn't fully sure whether this harmless gesture was appropriate. Yet in that invitation lay something more, an attempt to restore some lost closeness, to take the first step toward real dialogue. Evelyn felt a warm jolt of gratitude that he was trying to reconnect. "That's a good idea," she replied, trying to hide her nervousness. "Sure, we can get pizza or maybe some Asian noodles. Anything." He nodded, relief evident in his expression. It seemed both of them were craving the simple human normalcy that might calm their stirred-up emotions. Soon the kitchen table was laid out with boxes of steaming noodles, giving off a spicy aroma. They silently scooped portions onto plates and sat across from each other. An otherwise routine dinner now carried an undercurrent of tension and importance with every movement. "How was your day?" Michael asked in a low voice, twirling a fork in his hands. "I went through work emails," Evelyn said, shrugging. "But honestly, I wasn't too focused." She licked her lips before continuing. "All my thoughts, well, they kept circling back to what we talked about yesterday." Her confession sounded both bold and terrifying to her. Michael looked up and froze for a moment. Pain flickered in his eyes, as though he feared she was about to say something that would irreversibly destroy their shared world. "I get it," he said quietly, lowering the fork into his plate. "I can't get away from it either." A tense silence fell, full of unsaid words. Outside, darkness was gathering. A few cars passed below, and a single lamp cast a warm glow in the apartment. At some point, Evelyn decided to at least outline the issues that needed facing. "Michael," she began gently, "it seems we have to figure out whether we want to stay within our old framework or not. Otherwise, we'll just torment each other waiting." He ran a hand through his hair, clenching his fist nervously. "You think it's that easy to decide?" he asked bitterly. "I don't know. I never thought we could be more than friends. But what I feel, it's something I can't handle." Evelyn looked at him, compassion mingling with tenderness rising in her chest. He, who she had known as calm and steady, was now tormented, as though he himself couldn't believe where life had led them. "No one said it would be easy," she answered. "Maybe we really need to pull back a bit, Give each other space to figure it out. At the mention of distance, Michael twitched as though her words hurt him. For a moment, despair flickered across his face. Yeah, maybe, he said, voice taut, but it's unbearable to think I might lose you altogether. Their conversation, filled with honesty and fear, electrified the air in the small kitchen. The spicy aroma of their food and the faint hum of the fridge underscored the contrast between the everyday external world and the tempest inside them. Evelyn felt her heart pounding in unison with her thoughts. God, why has it become so complicated? Suddenly, Michael cautiously reached across the table, wanting to place his hand on hers. She froze, unsure whether she should allow any physical closeness. But seeing in his eyes the silent plea, "Let me show you I'm here," she did not pull away. "We'll find a way," she whispered, squeezing his hand in return. "We have to, or everything we've built will be for nothing." At that moment, Michael took a deep breath, trying to remain composed. It seemed he also needed this touch, to confirm they were still allies in wrestling with their feelings, not adversaries. When dinner was nearly over, Evelyn realized that although the conversation hadn't provided a final answer, it had somewhat eased her inner tension. Now they both knew they were willing to tackle the problem together, as they had done in simpler matters during earlier days. "Listen," Michael said, rising from the table, "maybe I'll go out for a walk. Clear my head. You don't mind?" Evelyn shook her head, picking up the leftovers. "Of course not. Maybe it's for the best," she answered calmly. "I need to think too." He smiled, but it was a sad smile. "Thanks for listening," he said softly. "I know this is hard." She caught herself wanting to hug him, but something within her whispered, "Careful. You're not sure how close you can let yourselves get without making it all more confusing." Instead, she simply nodded, letting him leave. Soon the front door clicked shut behind him. The apartment fell silent, filled with echoes of their conversation. Evelyn remained alone, listening to the thumping of her own heart and the whisper of anxious thoughts. In the air lingered the sense that their story was approaching a tipping point, and they would have to decide which path to take together. Left in the dim light of the living room, Evelyn returned to the window. Somewhere out there, among the city lights, Michael was wandering, searching for answers. She ran her hand across the fog glass, the warm outline of her palm clearly visible on the cool surface. That simple gesture suddenly felt symbolic. Both of them were leaving their prints on each other's souls, trying not to erase what had been built over the years. Deep inside, she felt that their talk gave them a chance to continue communicating without false silence. But another night and another day lay ahead, possibly requiring even more courage. The main thing is not to cling to the illusion of our old stability and not to fear the unknown, she thought, looking at the streetlights as if they were beacons illuminating a path in the darkness. So concluded the third day of their strange trial, filled with the struggle of emotions and the hope of finding a solution that wouldn't destroy their bond, but might grant it a new, hitherto undiscovered dimension. Night had deepened over the city when Michael returned from his lengthy walk, and Evelyn was still sitting in the semi-dark living room, resting her head on her folded arms on the back of the couch. Outside, a cool wind ruffled the sparse leaves on the trees, and it seemed like the echoes of her thoughts wandered through the streets. She hadn't turned on the main light, so as not to distract herself from the inner dialogue she had been hosting like a private gathering. When the front door opened quietly, Evelyn lifted her head, instantly detecting the faint scent of outside air and Michael's familiar presence, a mixture of morning aftershave lotion and the cool freshness of the night. He entered soundlessly, as though he hesitated to break her solitude. "Are you here?" he asked softly, feeling for the switch and turning on the standing lamp in the corner. "Yes," she responded in a muffled voice, trying to discern what might have changed in him during those hours alone. Michael looked tired, but there was a certain resolve in his eyes, as if he had come to some internal conclusion. He hesitated a moment, then sat on the couch beside her, keeping a small distance. The caution between them remained as palpable as before, but there was now something more, a sense of an impending step forward. "I've been thinking a lot," Michael said in a low voice. "Feels like we're running the same thoughts in circles. We're scared of ruining our friendship, but every time we try to pull away, it only gets worse." Evelyn closed her eyes and took a deep breath, as if drawing strength to answer honestly. Yeah, I feel that avoiding doesn't help. I tried to force myself to forget our conversation. But that's a lie, she admitted softly. Michael studied her face, and in the silence between them, an oppressive realization set in. Without a breakthrough, without an open resolution, they would remain stuck in uncertainty. Neither wanted to finalize things, but staying locked in this uneasy limbo was no solution either. As if longing to return to a simpler time, Evelyn ran her fingertips across the couch upholstery, the same couch where they had often watched movies, drank hot cocoa on cold evenings, and discussed work and tiredness. Memories of those carefree moments flashed through her mind, causing her heart to ache with the realization that everything was now painted in different tones. Do you remember how we could once laugh ourselves to tears, arguing about whose turn it was to wash the dishes? She asked with a sad smile. I never thought we'd be here, in this emotional deadlock. Michael gave a short nod. Me neither. But maybe this isn't a dead end. Maybe it's just the next chapter? His voice was husky but carried a spark of hope. As if yielding to an inner impulse, Michael shifted a little closer. Their hands ended up mere inches apart. Evelyn felt a surge of panic and bliss at once, a paradoxical feeling where she wanted both to draw near and to run away. Her heart pounded so loudly she thought passers-by outside could hear it. We can't keep going in circles, Michael said, and there was a flash of pain in his gaze. Either we try something new or we'd be better off parting ways than staying stuck in this indecision. The word parting made her start. The notion that one of them might move out, leave the familiar walls of their shared home, and go separate ways seemed too cruel. She realized she wasn't prepared for that turn of events. I don't want you to leave, Evelyn whispered, looking down. I'm afraid that if we act like nothing's there, one day we'll just explode from built-up tension. But if we go further, can it end well? I'm scared too, Michael confessed. But maybe living while pretending these feelings don't exist is scarier. We keep shutting each other out, as if forbidding ourselves to be honest. After these words, a silence full of racing heartbeats and heavy breaths fell. Time seemed to slow, giving them space to grasp the enormity of this moment. Then Michael carefully laid his hand on Evelyn's. She sensed a familiar, yet suddenly new touch. It was no longer the friendly gesture she'd known all these years, but something far more profound. If we try, he began, choosing his words, we'll have to make new rules, figure out how this will work. We were never just neighbors, but we also don't want our feelings to be a short spark that burns everything down. Evelyn felt a wave of excitement wash over her. Indeed, they were never merely neighbors. There was always a bond that exceeded formalities. Recognizing it now, opening up to a new level of the relationship, might lead down a risky road. Yet lingering in the gray zone of secret desires and fears seemed even more unbearable. Let's try not to get too close too fast, she suggested cautiously, but also not push each other away. If we're in this together, we need to be honest. Say what we feel without hiding behind the mask of friendship, and see where it takes us. Agreed, Michael replied, exhaling deeply as though his own heart was also pounding fiercely. I want to keep what's good between us, but I don't want to hide from myself anymore. Their brief conversation turned into a genuine breakthrough. They exposed the conflict, acknowledging that they must no longer fear stepping toward an unpredictable future. Evelyn felt an odd relief at being able to breathe more easily, as if the wall separating them had disappeared. Sure, there were still countless questions. What if the feelings proved stronger than they imagined? What if they ultimately couldn't find common ground romantically? But in that moment, both Michael and she realized that the bond between them was too strong to break out of fear. They sensed they could evolve without losing respect for each other. All right, Evelyn said, breaking the short silence with a smile. At least we covered one point. First on the list is honesty, right? Michael returned a slight but genuine smile. Exactly. And probably second is, take it slow. No rushing. And third, no hostility, she specified, feeling a flood of gentle warmth. If we feel discomfort or jealousy, we speak up immediately instead of bottling it up. They sat side by side, still holding hands, while the room was filled with a remarkable hush, underlined by the distant sounds of the night city. The tension seemed to dissolve, replaced by a deliberate clarity. The storm within their souls had not entirely passed, but they felt they were not alone in their fears. "You know," Michael said softly, blushing slightly, "when I walked around the city, I imagined for a minute that I was leaving the apartment, deciding to go somewhere else. And I realized that idea scared me far more than any potential problems we might face by staying here together." Evelyn waited a moment, absorbing his confession, then replied with equally quiet sincerity, "It's unbearable for me too, thinking we might suddenly stop being together. Maybe that in itself is the answer. Sometimes life nudges us toward a step we're afraid of, but it turns out to be the right one." They remained there for quite some time, not noticing how the night gave way to the bluish-violet pre-dawn glow. This conversation, filled with determination and caution, became their real breakthrough through barriers. They still had many trials ahead to discover whether they could grow something new and fragile out of friendship. Something beautiful. But one thing was clear: they would tackle it together, no longer hiding behind timid excuses or slipping away under the weight of fear. Thus ended the fourth chapter of their inner odyssey, brimming with hope for the future and a firm conviction that honesty and mutual understanding would be their main guides through the remaining shadows of doubt. Morning greeted Evelyn and Michael with an astonishing sense of novelty. Translucent rays of sunlight streamed through the curtains, illuminating dust motes in the air, like tiny silvery sparks dancing in the rhythm of their thoughts. In the apartment, once filled with tension and unspoken words, there was now a nearly tangible softness, as though the walls and furniture recognized that everything had changed. Evelyn woke earlier than usual, feeling a faint warmth spreading in her chest, mingling with a slight anxiety. She realized that last night they had taken an important step, deciding not to be afraid of their feelings, to open up to them, if only cautiously. This realization empowered her, yet the fragile nature of the situation weighed on her, as if any misstep could shatter the newly found balance. Rising from bed, she quietly donned a robe and walked into the kitchen, where the faint aroma of last night's meal still lingered. Leaning over the coffee maker, Evelyn listened to the drops of coffee sizzling into the glass pot, blending into a pungent brew promising alertness and mental clarity. Before she could pour her first cup, she heard cautious footsteps behind her. Turning, she saw Michael, sleepy, wearing a rumpled t-shirt, hair slightly tousled, yet a calmness glowed in his eyes. The tension of past days seemed to have gone, though it flickered faintly in his tentative smile. "Morning," he said, stepping close enough to be within arm's reach. "Hey," Evelyn answered softly. "Want some coffee?" He nodded, reaching for a mug on the shelf. For a moment, an awkward pause hung between them, but it was clear that the mutual discomfort no longer weighed so heavily. "Sleep okay?" Michael asked, trying to appear casual, though a hint of worry shone in his gaze. "Pretty well." Evelyn allowed herself a brief smile. "Last night's talk helped sort my thoughts." He gave a knowing nod, as if agreeing that yes, they had finally shed the burden of silence. Accepting a cup of coffee from her, he took a small sip, savoring the aroma, and then quietly said, "Listen, I wanted to say something, to say thank you for not turning away, not shutting me out." Evelyn averted her eyes, her fingers curled around the mug's handle. "I was also afraid it would end up worse," she replied. "But you know, I guess I'm less scared now." They settled on the tall stools at the kitchen island, with a notepad full of weekend grocery lists sitting between them, still containing blank lines like a symbol that everything in their life was open to new decisions. A month ago, they might have argued about whether to buy pre-made meals or cook themselves, but now every little detail could carry deeper meaning. "Since we've decided to move forward slowly," Evelyn said, raising her eyebrow encouragingly, "what if we go somewhere together today? Just take a walk, maybe get coffee outside the house." Her suggestion carried a simple, almost romantic undertone that sent a tremor of joy through Michael. A routine stroll could be their first shared day in this new, if not yet official, capacity. "Sure," he replied, trying not to show too much excitement. "Maybe pick a quiet cafe on the outskirts, so we don't run into friends." They both laughed, realizing they were subconsciously hiding their changes, dreading curious glances or questions. Yet it felt more like a playful secret than a painful taboo. By noon, they stepped out of the apartment. The sunshine pleasantly warmed the city after the previous day's gloom. Michael and Evelyn walked along the streets, lined with young trees, with the scent of fresh bakery drifting from local shops. On a normal day, such a walk would have raised no questions, but now almost every step felt special. Reaching a small park, Evelyn glanced at the friendly green walkways and suggested they sit on a bench away from the busier paths. There were no crowds here, only a few moms with strollers and an elderly couple strolling in the distance. Michael and Evelyn settled side by side, and in that moment, he felt an urge to take her hand wordlessly, as if it were a natural next step. But he remembered their agreement not to rush things. "This feels so odd," he confessed softly. "We used to walk like friends, and I never thought I might feel anything more. But now, it's all different." "Yeah, I've been thinking about that too," Evelyn said quietly, gently brushing his elbow. "In one way, we're still the same people, but in another, the way we perceive each other has changed." They exchanged smiles that seemed to say, "Maybe we don't want to deny this change anymore." The bench creaked as Michael shifted slightly closer. He turned to face her, trying to meet her eyes. "I'm not sure how to behave in situations like this," he said with a shy laugh, "but you probably feel it too. The lightness between us, like we took off a heavy mask." "Yes, that's true," she nodded. "I no longer have to pretend my glances at you are just friendly curiosity. I won't lie. It feels good being around you. And the strangest thing is, I'm not tormented by guilt or fear. It's like I've come alive." Evelyn's words were so sincere that Michael felt a warmth spread through his chest, and before thinking it through, he lightly touched her fingers, resting on her lap. She responded by gently squeezing his hand, and with no one else around, there was no embarrassment. "I hope we're not rushing things," he added, blushing slightly. "After all, there's a risk we could ruin it by diving in too fast." Evelyn exhaled, feeling her heartbeat grow unsteady. "Agreed. We need to pace ourselves. But ignoring our feelings is already pointless. Maybe we should at least allow ourselves this chance to be a bit closer." He smiled, pausing a moment on her gaze. Both of them felt an echoing thought. We truly want to explore something that goes beyond our old friendship, and it was no longer a burdensome secret, but a mutual acknowledgement that gave hope their relationship might not necessarily be destroyed, but instead could become something special. Wrapped up in the peaceful setting of the park, they failed to notice a longtime acquaintance of Evelyn's, Sarah, approaching them along the path. Seeing Evelyn sitting there with Michael, Sarah raised her eyebrows in surprise. Before this, she only knew them as roommates, never suspecting any other relationship. "Hey guys," she called cheerfully, walking over. "Nice to see you. Do you often go out together?" Evelyn and Michael exchanged looks. Sarah's tone held nothing suspicious, more like friendly curiosity. Nonetheless, Evelyn felt her nerves spark. They still weren't ready to tell acquaintances about their changes. "Hi, Sarah," Evelyn responded with a casual smile. "Yeah, we decided to take a walk. The weather's so nice we needed to get out." Michael nodded in agreement, greeting Sarah with a small wave. At that moment, they let go of each other's hands which had been joined on the bench. Both felt a jolt of awkwardness, as if caught in a personal moment. Politely, Sarah pretended not to notice, suggesting they join her for coffee at a nearby stand. They politely declined, citing other plans. Sarah shrugged, wished them a good evening, and walked off, throwing an intrigued glance over her shoulder. When Sarah disappeared among the trees, Michael exhaled. "Looks like we'll have to explain to people one way or another. If not now, then later." "Perhaps," Evelyn agreed. "But I think we have the right to keep this new feeling to ourselves for a while, without extra questions. I'm not in a hurry to justify anything to others until we figure it out ourselves." They sat a while longer, watching life flow calmly in the park as the sun dipped toward the horizon. Their sense of unity grew, minus the previous fear, though tension lingered. Many discussions and decisions awaited them because their bond was evolving before their eyes and it was unclear where it might lead. By the end of the walk, they decided to keep living as heart and mind guided them, to learn to listen to each other, speak honestly about doubts. This simple yet strong promise marked a new stage on their path to transformation. both in their relationship and in how they viewed themselves. Heading back home, Michael and Evelyn exchanged a glance full of warmth and readiness to move forward. Both understood that the old world wouldn't return, but it wasn't a reason to be afraid. Rather, a sign they were beginning a new story, where recognizing their feelings gave them a chance to be genuinely truthful. The next day arrived, and the sun rose over the horizon, filling the city with warm golden rays. The residential area, where Michael and Evelyn's apartment was located, slowly woke up. Outside their windows, the buzz of traffic sounded, as though life itself was returning to normal after a long night. Yet in our heroes' hearts, nothing could be the same anymore. Something entirely different was stirring within them, binding their fates even more tightly. Evelyn awoke to the quiet rustle in the kitchen, where Michael had apparently decided to take charge of breakfast. Through the half-open curtains, gentle daylight streamed in, and she got up feeling an unusual lightness. The anxieties of the past week still echoed, but along with them came a fresh assurance, an assurance that they could be together without losing each other or breaking themselves. Walking into the kitchen, she saw Michael at the stove, carefully stirring eggs that sizzled in the pan. Nearby were toast and coffee cups. Hearing her footsteps, he turned with a slight smile, not a trace of yesterday's tension on his face. "Morning," he said, as if adjusting to the new tone in how they spoke. "Morning," Evelyn replied, stepping closer. She felt the warmth of his presence, and it seemed the very air of the apartment welcomed them in its embrace. Sitting at the table, they ate their breakfast in a nearly home-like atmosphere, chatting about small things, the weather, their evening plans, or schedule changes at work. Yet something more than everyday talk floated in the air. Both sensed a new closeness, rooted in the secret they were no longer concealing from each other. "You know," said Evelyn, tearing off a piece of toast, "at some point I realized that in order for life to move in a new direction, you have to take a risk. And we've been afraid all this time, thinking it would destroy our friendship. But it seems it's given us something valuable." Michael nodded, setting his coffee mug down on the table. "I feel the same. Fear isn't always a stop sign. Sometimes it's a signal to proceed carefully, but proceed. If we had kept acting like nothing had changed, we would have suffered a lot more." Their eyes met in a quiet moment of mutual understanding, two gazes reflecting a shared past of routine and mutual support, as well as a future now just beginning to form. Having finished breakfast, they discussed how to spend the day. Some tension remained over how their friends and acquaintances might react. Sooner or later, they'd have to explain these changes, at least to some in their inner circle. "What do you think? Didn't Sarah suspect something yesterday in the park?" Michael asked, raising an eyebrow. "Knowing her curiosity, she might have noticed how close we were," Evelyn said with a smirk. "But I don't think she'll immediately guess what's going on." Michael paused, reflecting. How soon do we want people to find out? Or should we wait until we're fully sure ourselves? For now, let's figure it out ourselves, she nodded, lightly touching his arm. I think if we reach a stable place in our relationship, we'll find a way to tell people. In the meantime, no one needs extra speculation. After breakfast, they decided to tidy up the living room, where they had been planning to sort old items and magazines. While doing so, Evelyn came across a photo album full of snapshots from weekends away, trips to a country house, playful moments from a time when they had no idea of the depth their feelings could reach. Leafing through these photos, Michael and Evelyn reminisced with a mix of nostalgia and fondness, laughing at frames capturing them being carefree and naive. Look, here's our trip to Massachusetts 2 years ago. She pointed to a picture of them hugging each other by an old lighthouse. Back then, we were sure we were just really good friends. Yeah, Michael smiled, touching the photo with his fingertips. And now everything's changed, but our bond seems only stronger. Who would have guessed? It was as if the album served as proof that their story hadn't begun from scratch, but had grown from a solid foundation of mutual support. At the same time, they realized how much more might await them if they dared to accept their feelings as they were. Once the room was tidy again, they noticed it was already nearing noon. Stretching, Michael raised a question that hung in the air. Evelyn, aren't you afraid we're getting close too fast? I realize we've been friends for a while, but once romance is involved, it changes everything. She paused, looking out the window where bright sunlight poured in. It scares me. Honestly, I'm worried that at some point we'll run into misunderstanding or jealousy. But it also seems to me that if we're open about every doubt, not hiding anything, we'll manage. Michael stepped closer, carefully touching her hand. Agreed. Honesty is our main support, I think. When you hide everything, feelings become destructive. We've had enough suffering from silence. They exchanged warm glances. There was no passionate scene. Everything was unfolding gently, as though the very walls of this home, familiar with countless friendly talks, favored their choice to be genuine and gentle with one another. That afternoon, they took a short trip to nearby shops, buying groceries and peeking into a small cafe, where Michael discreetly tried to hold the door for Evelyn a bit longer than usual. She realized she felt a pleasant flutter from such small gestures. Once back home, they returned to their usual routines, but with the realization that their relationship had reached a new level. As evening fell over the city, Evelyn sat on the windowsill in the living room, watching the crimson-orange sun disappear behind rooftops. Michael entered quietly, laying a hand on her shoulder. She felt its warmth and smiled without turning around. "This evening feels magical," she said softly, and suddenly I realized, I'm not afraid of the future. I want to believe we'll manage. He stroked her shoulder with his fingers, giving a slight reassuring squeeze. "I want to believe it too," he responded. "The main thing is we chose to be honest. Probably our only real anchor." Their conversation paused at the gentle knocking of wind against the window, followed by a tranquil closeness, full of the knowledge that they still faced challenges, different perspectives, possible disagreements and reconciliations. But the crushing terror that once made them hide and run had disappeared. Now they were partners in seeking a balance between friendship and romance, between familiar stability and a new, electrifying attraction. The end of this chapter in Evelyn and Michael's life was filled with ambiguity, but also a piercing hope. Their story was taking shape. Two adults who had once vowed never to mix friendship with love were now standing on a threshold containing both danger and freedom. There were no grand, world-shouting confessions or vows of eternal happiness, only a choice in the present moment, made with thoughtfulness and cautious trust. Before bed, they stayed in the living room, immersed in quiet conversation, and every word, every look carried a sense of release. They were no longer enemies to their feelings or prisoners of their old agreement, but rather two people who had dared to allow themselves something more than ever before. The soft glow of the floor lamp, the gentle hum of the fridge, and their subdued laughter in the dimly lit room, all this merged into a simple awareness that, here next to them, was someone truly dear. Thus the day ended, but not the story. Together they stepped into a new dawn, leaving behind the troubled nights of doubt and guilt. The open door of the future promised further trials and the joy of discovering that, at heart, they had always been close. Now that closeness was deeper, slightly more risky, yet far more honest, because only by moving through fear could they discover a genuine feeling grounded in free choice rather than illusion or obligation.